The Shadows of Greyfriars, the Haunted Graveyard of Edinburgh. Part 1. The City of Unease. Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, is a city where history seeps through every stone. Its towering castles, ancient streets, and Gothic architecture tell tales of a past filled with grandeur and terror. Among its many landmarks, Greyfriars Kirkyard stands out, not just as a historical cemetery but as one of the most haunted places in the world. Yet beneath the beautiful facades and tourist-friendly ambience, a chilling darkness lingers. The cemetery, established in the 16th century, is more than just a burial ground. It is a repository of stories of plague victims, executed criminals, and tortured souls whose restless spirits are said to roam the grounds to this day. Visitors to the kirkyard have often reported feeling an eerie presence, a sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, or a sudden drop in temperature, as if something cold and malevolent has brushed past them. Some claim to hear faint whispers carried on the wind, while others speak of strange shadows that flit between the gravestones. Greyfriars Kirkyard has been the subject of fascination for paranormal enthusiasts for centuries. Its haunted reputation is not mere folklore, it's a reality documented by countless accounts of ghostly encounters. But of all the spirits said to haunt the cemetery, one, in particular, stands out for its sheer malevolence: the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, better known as the Mackenzie Poltergeist. Sir George Mackenzie was a prominent figure in 17th century Scotland, known for his role in the persecution of the Covenanters. The Covenanters were a group of Scottish Presbyterians who stood against the interference of the king in religious matters. Mackenzie, as the Lord Advocate, was responsible for the imprisonment, torture, and execution of thousands of these dissenters. His relentless cruelty earned him the nickname Bluety Mackenzie, a moniker that continues to send shivers down the spines of those who hear it. But death did not bring peace to Mackenzie. Instead, it seems to have only heightened his thirst for vengeance. His spirit, disturbed and angered by the desecration of his tomb centuries later, is believed to be the cause of the violent poltergeist activity that plagues Greyfriars Kirkyard. The Mackenzie poltergeist is not a benign spirit, it is a force of pure malevolence, capable of inflicting harm on those who dare to venture too close to its resting place. Part 2. The birth of the Mackenzie poltergeist. The story of the Mackenzie poltergeist begins on a cold, stormy night in 1998. The weather was particularly harsh that evening, with biting winds howling through the narrow streets of Edinburgh and rain lashing down with unrelenting force. It was the kind of night that kept most people indoors, huddled around fires or under blankets. But for one homeless man, there was no such refuge. Desperate for shelter, he sought out the only place that offered any protection from the elements: Greyfriars Kirkyard. The man, whose name has been lost to history, was driven by sheer necessity when he forced open the iron door of Sir George Mackenzie's mausoleum. The heavy door creaked ominously as it swung open, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air inside the crypt was thick with the scent of decay, a testament to the centuries that had passed since Mackenzie's body had been interred there. Shivering from cold and fear, the man ventured deeper into the crypt, using a small, flickering lighter to illuminate his way. As he explored the tomb, he stumbled upon something unexpected: a weak section of the wall. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, he pushed against it, causing the wall to give way and reveal a hidden chamber beyond. What he found inside was the stuff of nightmares. The chamber was filled with human bones, piled haphazardly on the floor as if they had been discarded like so much refuse. The sight was so horrifying that the man fled the crypt in terror, leaving the mausoleum door ajar behind him. But his intrusion had awakened something dark and vengeful, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. From that night on, the Mackenzie poltergeist made its presence known in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Visitors to Greyfriars Kirkyard began to experience violent paranormal activity, including being shoved, scratched, and even knocked unconscious by an unseen force. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, became a site of terror, where the boundary between the living and the dead was frighteningly thin. The local authorities were initially skeptical of the reports, dismissing them as the product of overactive imaginations or the effects of the cold, damp atmosphere. But as the number of incidents grew, it became clear that something genuinely disturbing was happening in Greyfriars kirkyard. Cemetery staff began to report strange occurrences as well, from shadowy figures moving among the graves to inexplicable noises in the dead of night. One of the most chilling aspects of the Mackenzie poltergeist is its ability to physically harm those who encounter it. Unlike many ghostly apparitions, which are content to simply frighten or unsettle, the Mackenzie poltergeist is known for its violent tendencies. Numerous visitors have left the cemetery with scratches, bruises, and other injuries that appeared suddenly and without explanation. Part 3: The Covenanters' Prison and the Spirits Within. The heart of the Mackenzie poltergeist's power seems to be centered around the Covenanters' Prison, a section of Greyfriars kirkyard with a particularly dark history. The prison was used to incarcerate hundreds of Covenanters after they were captured at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679. The conditions in the prison were nothing short of hellish. The Covenanters were kept in open-air cells, exposed to the harsh Scottish weather, and given little food or water. Many died from starvation, disease, or the sheer brutality of their captors. The bodies of those who perished in the prison were buried in mass graves, their final resting places marked only by the cold, unyielding earth. The sheer number of deaths, combined with the suffering these individuals endured, has imbued the area with a palpable sense of sorrow and despair. It is said that the spirits of the Covenanters still linger in the prison, their restless souls unable to find peace after the atrocities they suffered. It is within this grim setting that the Mackenzie poltergeist exerts its greatest influence. The prison's oppressive atmosphere, combined with the tragic history of those who died there, creates a perfect storm for paranormal activity. Visitors to the Covenanters' prison often report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air is thick with the weight of the past. Some have even claimed to hear the faint sounds of weeping or the clanking of chains, echoes of the suffering that once took place within those walls. The Covenanters' prison is not a place for the faint of heart. Those who dare to enter do so at their own risk, as the Mackenzie poltergeist is known to be particularly aggressive in this area. Many of the most severe attacks have occurred within the prison, including reports of people being knocked to the ground, choked by invisible hands, or suddenly overcome by a paralyzing fear. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Mackenzie poltergeist's presence in the Covenanters' prison is the way it seems to target specific individuals. There are accounts of people who have visited the prison multiple times without incident, only to be violently attacked on a subsequent visit. It is as if the poltergeist bides its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. Some believe that the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, who was responsible for the suffering of the Covenanters, is still driven by a desire for vengeance, seeking out those who trespass on his domain. Part 4: The Legend Grows. As the legend of the Mackenzie poltergeist spread, Greyfriars kirkyard became a magnet for ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and thrill seekers from around the world. What was once a quiet, historical cemetery quickly transformed into a hub of supernatural activity, drawing the curious and the brave alike. Ghost tours began operating regularly, offering visitors the chance to experience the eerie atmosphere of the kirkyard for themselves. These tours became infamous for the encounters that guests would experience. Tour guides, often seasoned by countless journeys into the cemetery at night, would lead groups through the darkened grounds, recounting tales of the kirkyard's haunted past. However, the Mackenzie poltergeist had no regard for schedules or entertainment. On many occasions, the tours would be interrupted by sudden, terrifying incidents. Guests would scream as they felt icy fingers brush against their skin, or as they were suddenly shoved or scratched by an invisible force. Some fainted from sheer terror, while others fled in panic, swearing never to return. The ghost tours, despite the danger, only fueled the fire of the legend. The more people talked about the Mackenzie poltergeist, the stronger its presence seemed to become. The tales of violent encounters spread like wildfire, with each new account adding to the poltergeist's fearsome reputation. The media took notice, and soon Greyfriars Kirkyard was featured in television documentaries, books, and articles exploring the world's most haunted places. But the increased attention also brought increased scrutiny. Paranormal investigators flocked to the cemetery, eager to capture evidence of the Mackenzie poltergeist. Some brought advanced equipment, such as electromagnetic field detectors, thermal cameras, and voice recorders, hoping to document the phenomena that so many had experienced. The results were often chilling. EMF meters would spike inexplicably, cold spots would appear in the middle of warm summer nights, and strange, disembodied voices would be captured on tape, uttering words of warning or anger. Yet, despite the growing mountain of evidence, the Mackenzie poltergeist remained an enigma. No one could say for certain what it was or why it had chosen to haunt Greyfriars Kirkyard with such intensity. Some speculated that it was the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie himself, unable to find peace in death due to the atrocities he had committed in life. Others believed that the poltergeist was not Mackenzie at all, but rather the collective anger and sorrow of the many souls who had suffered in the Covenanters' prison. Part 5: The Aftermath of a Haunting. The stories of the Mackenzie poltergeist have become so pervasive that they have had a lasting impact on the city of Edinburgh. The cemetery, once a solemn place of reflection, has taken on a new identity as a site of supernatural intrigue. While some locals view the ghostly reputation with skepticism, others embrace it, seeing it as a connection to the city's rich and often dark history. However, for those who have had direct encounters with the Mackenzie poltergeist, the experience is anything but entertaining. Many individuals who have visited Greyfriars Kirkyard have reported experiencing symptoms that linger long after they've left the cemetery. These include unexplained bruises and scratches, nightmares, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Some have even claimed that the poltergeist followed them home, causing disturbances in their own houses. One particularly chilling account comes from a woman who visited Greyfriars Kirkyard during one of the ghost tours. According to her, she felt a sharp pain in her side while standing near the Black Mausoleum, the site of the Mackenzie poltergeist's most notorious activity. When she lifted her shirt to inspect the area, she found 3 deep scratches running down her side, as if she had been clawed by an unseen force. The scratches took weeks to heal, and during that time, she experienced a series of disturbing events, including objects moving on their own in her home and the sensation of being watched while she slept. The psychological effects of an encounter with the Mackenzie poltergeist can be just as devastating as the physical ones. Many people report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread or anxiety after visiting the cemetery, as if they have brought something dark and malevolent back with them. These feelings can persist for days, weeks, or even longer, making it difficult for them to return to their normal lives. The authorities in Edinburgh have responded to the reports with caution. While the police have investigated several claims of assault in Greyfriars Kirkyard, they have been unable to find any evidence of human perpetrators. The City Council has considered restricting access to certain parts of the cemetery, particularly the Covenanters' prison, in an effort to protect the public. However, these measures have done little to deter those who are determined to experience the paranormal for themselves. Part 6: The Role of Fear. Fear plays a significant role in the power of the Mackenzie poltergeist. It is said that the poltergeist feeds on the fear of those who encounter it, drawing strength from their terror. This idea is supported by the fact that the poltergeist's activity tends to be more intense when its victims are particularly frightened. For example, those who enter the Black Mausoleum with a sense of dread or apprehension are more likely to experience violent encounters than those who approach the site with skepticism or indifference. This connection between fear and the supernatural is not unique to Greyfriars Kirkyard. Throughout history, there have been countless accounts of ghosts and spirits that seem to grow stronger in the presence of fear. It is as if these entities are somehow energized by the emotions of the living, using them as a source of power. In the case of the Mackenzie Poltergeist, this may explain why its attacks are often so sudden and violent. The poltergeist may be attempting to elicit a strong emotional response from its victims in order to increase its own strength. The role of fear in paranormal phenomena has been the subject of much debate among researchers. Some believe that fear can actually create ghostly manifestations, a phenomenon known as a thought form. According to this theory, the intense emotions of fear and anxiety can cause a person to project their thoughts and feelings into the environment, creating a ghost or spirit that reflects their inner turmoil. In the case of Greyfriars Kirkyard, it is possible that the legend of the Mackenzie Poltergeist has become so ingrained in the public consciousness that it has taken on a life of its own, fueled by the collective fear of those who visit the cemetery. Part 7: Encounters with the Poltergeist. Over the years, there have been countless encounters with the Mackenzie Poltergeist, each one more terrifying than the last. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 2000, when a woman named Mary King visited Greyfriars Kirkyard with her daughter. They were part of a ghost tour that had taken them through the cemetery after dark. As they approached the Black Mausoleum, Mary felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery. But as they stood outside the mausoleum, something strange happened. Mary suddenly felt a sharp, burning sensation on her back. She cried out in pain, causing the tour guide to stop and ask what was wrong. Mary lifted her shirt to reveal several deep scratches running down her back, similar to the ones described by others who had encountered the Mackenzie Poltergeist. The scratches were fresh and bleeding, as if they had been made by a sharp object. The tour guide, who was familiar with the poltergeist's activity, immediately recognized the signs of an attack. He hurried the group away from the mausoleum, but the damage had already been done. Mary was shaken by the experience, and her daughter was terrified. They left the tour early and returned to their hotel, where Mary spent the rest of the night in pain and fear. Mary's story is just one of many similar accounts. Visitors to Greyfriars Kirkyard have reported being pushed, scratched, and even bitten by the Mackenzie Poltergeist. Some have described feeling an intense pressure on their chest, as if they were being crushed by an invisible force. Others have spoken of sudden, overwhelming feelings of sadness or despair, as if they were being consumed by the emotions of the dead. One of the most disturbing aspects of these encounters is the way the poltergeist seems to choose its victims. There is no apparent pattern to the attacks. They can happen to anyone, at any time. The randomness of the attacks only adds to the fear, as visitors never know when or if they will be targeted. This unpredictability has led some to believe that the Mackenzie Poltergeist is not a single entity, but rather a collection of spirits, each with its own agenda. Part 8: Attempts to banish the poltergeist. In an effort to put an end to the terrifying activity in Greyfriars Kirkyard, several attempts have been made to banish the Mackenzie Poltergeist. These efforts have ranged from religious rituals to modern paranormal cleansing techniques, but none have been successful in ridding the cemetery of its most infamous resident. One of the earliest attempts to banish the poltergeist took place in the early 2000s, when a local priest was called upon to perform an exorcism at the Black Mausoleum. The priest, who had experience with exorcisms, arrived at the cemetery with a small group of assistants. They brought with them holy water, crucifixes, and other religious items, all intended to drive the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie out of the mausoleum and away from Greyfriars Kirkyard for good. The exorcism began with prayers and the sprinkling of holy water around the entrance to the mausoleum. The priest then entered the mausoleum itself, reciting prayers and commanding the spirit to leave in the name of God. As the ritual progressed, Those present reported feeling a strange energy in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with tension. The priest continued with the exorcism, determined to see it through to the end. But as the ritual reached its climax, something went horribly wrong. The priest suddenly screamed and fell to the ground, clutching his chest. He was quickly helped out of the mausoleum and taken to a nearby hospital, where it was discovered that he had suffered a heart attack. The exorcism was never completed, and the poltergeist remained. This failed exorcism only served to strengthen the legend of the Mackenzie poltergeist. The idea that even a priest could be overwhelmed by the spirit's power added to the fear surrounding Greyfriars kirkyard. Subsequent attempts to cleanse the cemetery, including smudging rituals with sage and the use of crystals, have also failed to make any lasting impact. The Mackenzie poltergeist continues to haunt the kirkyard, seemingly impervious to all efforts to remove it. Part 9: Theories and Speculations. The enduring presence of the Mackenzie poltergeist has led to numerous theories and speculations about the true nature of the entity. Some believe that the poltergeist is indeed the spirit of Sir George Mackenzie, condemned to an eternity of unrest because of the atrocities he committed in life. According to this theory, Mackenzie's spirit is unable to find peace because of the guilt and anger he carries with him, and he lashes out at the living in a desperate attempt to alleviate his suffering. Others suggest that the poltergeist may not be Mackenzie at all, but rather a manifestation of the collective trauma and suffering experienced by those who died in the Covenanters' prison. This theory posits that the energy created by the mass deaths in the prison has coalesced into a powerful, malevolent force that haunts the cemetery. In this view, the poltergeist is not a single spirit, but rather an amalgamation of many tortured souls. A more skeptical perspective argues that the Mackenzie poltergeist is not a supernatural entity at all, but rather a product of psychological suggestion and environmental factors. According to this theory, the power of suggestion, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery, causes people to believe they are experiencing paranormal activity, when in fact they are simply reacting to natural stimuli. The cold spots, strange noises, and feelings of dread could all be explained by the environment of Greyfriars kirkyard, which is known for its damp, cold, and dark conditions. Despite the various theories, no one has been able to definitively explain the phenomena associated with the Mackenzie poltergeist. The entity remains an enigma, its true nature shrouded in mystery. What is certain, however, is that the poltergeist continues to be one of the most compelling and terrifying paranormal legends in the world. Part 10: The Legacy of the Mackenzie Poltergeist. The legend of the Mackenzie poltergeist has become deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric of Edinburgh. It is a story that has been passed down through generations, capturing the imaginations of those who hear it. The poltergeist has become a symbol of the city's haunted history, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that the dead can sometimes reach out from beyond the grave. Greyfriars kirkyard, once a quiet resting place for the dead, has become a focal point for ghost stories and paranormal investigations. The cemetery draws visitors from all over the world, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural or to experience the chilling presence of the Mackenzie poltergeist for themselves. While some come out of curiosity, others are driven by a deeper fascination with the unknown, a desire to explore the boundaries between life and death. The legacy of the Mackenzie poltergeist is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of disturbing the dead. The story serves as a reminder that actions taken in life can have consequences that extend beyond the grave. Sir George Mackenzie's persecution of the Covenanters left a lasting mark on history, and if the poltergeist is indeed his spirit, it is a sign that his soul has never found peace. As the years go by, the legend of the Mackenzie poltergeist will likely continue to grow, fueled by new encounters and retellings of old stories. Greyfriars kirkyard will remain a place of intrigue and fear, a site where the past and present collide in a chilling dance of the supernatural. And the Mackenzie poltergeist, whether it is the vengeful spirit of a cruel man or the embodiment of centuries-old suffering, will continue to haunt the dark corners of Edinburgh, a shadow that refuses to fade away. The Haunting of La Llorona's River, a true tale of terror. Part 1. The legend begins. In a remote village in Mexico, nestled among the dense forests and winding rivers, there exists a chilling legend passed down through generations, the tale of La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. Her story is one of sorrow, madness, and revenge, and it has left a deep scar on the collective memory of those who have heard it. But for one family, the legend became a terrifying reality, a nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The story of La Llorona is well known in Mexican folklore. It is said that she was once a beautiful woman named Maria, who fell deeply in love with a wealthy man. Together they had 2 children, whom Maria loved dearly. However, her husband's affection began to wane, and he eventually left her for another woman. In a fit of rage and despair, Maria drowned her children in the river, only to be consumed by guilt moments later. Realizing the horror of what she had done, she threw herself into the river, where she too perished. But death was not the end for Maria. According to the legend, her spirit was condemned to roam the earth for eternity, searching for her lost children. Her wails of grief echo through the night, and those who hear her cries are said to be cursed. She is known as La Llorona, and she is feared throughout Mexico and beyond. For many, the story of La Llorona is just that, a story. But for the Ramirez family, it became something far more sinister. It was the summer of 1998, and they had recently moved to a small town near the outskirts of Mexico City. The town was peaceful, a quiet place where they hoped to start anew after a series of hardships, but their tranquility would be shattered by the horrors that awaited them. Part 2. The First Signs. The Ramirez family consisted of Carlos, his wife Maria, and their 2 children, Lucia and Javier. They were excited about their new home, a modest house situated near a picturesque river that flowed through the town. The river was a source of pride for the locals, who spoke of its beauty and the abundance of fish it provided. But there was also an unspoken unease that lingered in the air whenever the river was mentioned, a discomfort that the Ramirezes would soon come to understand. It began with strange noises at night. Carlos and Maria would often be awakened by the sound of crying, soft at first, but growing louder and more anguished as the nights passed. They dismissed it as the wind or perhaps a stray animal, but the cries persisted, becoming more distinct and human-like. There was a sorrow in the voice, a desperation that sent chills down their spines. But they tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away on its own. Then came the nightmares. Lucia, their daughter, was the first to be affected. She began waking up in the middle of the night, screaming in terror. When her parents rushed to her side, she would tell them about a woman who appeared in her dreams, a woman with long, dark hair and a flowing white dress, her face obscured by shadows. The woman would stand at the edge of the river, weeping uncontrollably, before turning to Lucia with eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The nightmares grew more frequent and more vivid. Lucia would wake up with scratches on her arms, as if she had been attacked in her sleep. Javier, the younger child, started seeing the same woman in his dreams, and he too would wake up in a panic, clutching at his chest as if he were suffocating. The family was terrified, but they had no explanation for what was happening. They sought help from the local priest, who blessed the house and prayed for their protection, but the disturbances only grew worse. Part 3. The Encounter. One night, as the family sat together in the living room, trying to comfort their frightened children, they heard the crying again. This time, it was louder than ever, echoing through the house with a haunting clarity. The sound seemed to come from the river, but it was as if the woman was standing right outside their door. Carlos, determined to find out what was causing the disturbance, grabbed a flashlight and headed outside, despite Maria's protests. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. Carlos walked toward the river, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the water's edge, the crying grew louder, more anguished. He shone his flashlight across the river, scanning the area for any sign of movement. And then he saw her. A figure stood on the opposite bank of the river, her long hair cascading down her back, her white dress billowing in the wind. She was turned away from him, her face hidden, but there was no mistaking the sorrow that emanated from her. Carlos froze, his breath catching in his throat. The stories of La Llorona flashed through his mind, and he realized with horror that he was staring at the ghostly figure from the legend. He tried to move, to run back to the safety of his home, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The woman slowly turned around, revealing her face, or rather, the lack of one. Where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty voids, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque scream of anguish. She reached out toward Carlos, her bony fingers stretching across the river as if to grab him. With a burst of adrenaline, Carlos finally broke free from his paralysis and ran back to the house, slamming the door behind him. He was shaking, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He knew what he had seen, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it. Maria tried to comfort him, but the terror in his eyes was undeniable. They were no longer dealing with a simple ghost story. This was something far more dangerous. Part 4, The Haunting Intensifies. After Carlos's encounter with La Llorona, the haunting escalated to a new level of terror. The crying became a constant presence, heard at all hours of the day and night. The family began to feel a suffocating presence in their home, as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and the temperature in the house would drop suddenly, leaving them shivering even in the heat of summer. Lucia and Javier's nightmares became more intense, with both children waking up screaming in the middle of the night. They spoke of being chased by La Llorona, her skeletal hands reaching out to drag them into the river. They would wake up drenched in sweat, their sheets twisted and torn as if they had been struggling in their sleep. The scratches on their arms and legs grew deeper, and no amount of prayer or protection seemed to stop the attacks. Maria, who had always been the rock of the family, began to break down under the strain. She would sit by the window for hours, staring out at the river with vacant eyes. She claimed to hear La Llorona's voice calling her name, urging her to come to the water's edge. Carlos would find her standing by the river late at night, her feet inches from the water, as if she were in a trance. He would have to physically drag her back to the house, but she would resist, her eyes glazed over as she mumbled incoherently about needing to find the children. The family's mental and physical health deteriorated rapidly. They stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and became isolated from the rest of the community. Friends and neighbors noticed the change and offered their help, but the Ramirez family was too far gone, consumed by the terror that had taken hold of their lives. The once happy home was now a place of despair, its walls echoing with the cries of a vengeful spirit. Part 5, Seeking Help. Desperate for a solution, Carlos decided to seek the help of a curandera, a traditional healer who was known for her knowledge of the supernatural. He had heard stories of her abilities, how she had helped others who were plagued by spirits, and he hoped that she could do the same for his family. With little else to lose, he made the journey to her home, a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town. The curandera, an elderly woman with wise, knowing eyes, listened intently as Carlos recounted the horrors his family had been experiencing. She nodded gravely, her expression growing more serious as he spoke. When he finished, she told him that La Llorona was a powerful spirit, one that had been fueled by centuries of pain and suffering. She explained that the spirit had latched onto the Ramirez family, drawn to their own grief and fear, and that it would not be easy to break the connection. She agreed to help, but warned Carlos that the process would be difficult and dangerous. The spirit would not let go without a fight, and there was a risk that it could become even more violent, but Carlos was willing to do whatever it took to save his family. The curandera gave him a list of items to gather herbs, candles, and other materials and instructed him to return with them the next day. When Carlos returned home, he found Maria in a worse state than ever. She was sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, rocking back and forth as she muttered to herself. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her skin was pale and clammy. The children were huddled together on the couch, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Carlos knew that they were running out of time. That night, the curandera arrived at their home. She set up an altar in the living room, placing the items Carlos had gathered in a precise arrangement. She lit the candles and began to chant, her voice low and rhythmic. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Carlos's neck stand up. The curandera's chants grew louder, more urgent, as if she were trying to reach out to the spirit that haunted them. For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the windows in the house shattered, sending glass flying in all directions. The candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a chilling wind blew through the house, despite all the doors and windows being closed. The curandera continued to chant, her voice rising above the chaos, but it was clear that the spirit was fighting back. Part 6: The Battle for Survival. The Ramirez family huddled together, fear gripping their hearts as the curandera continued her ritual. The howling wind grew louder, the temperature plunging even further until their breath was visible in the frigid air. The spirit's presence was almost tangible now, a malevolent force that filled the room with an oppressive weight. The curandera's voice wavered, but she did not stop, determined to drive the spirit out once and for all. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and a figure stepped inside. It was La Llorona, her ghostly form more solid than before. Her hair was a tangled mess, her white dress stained with mud and water. Her face, once obscured, was now fully visible, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to burn with an unearthly fire. She opened her mouth, and the sound that emerged was a blood-curdling wail, a cry of unimaginable sorrow and rage. The curandera faltered, her chanting momentarily silenced by the apparition's presence. La Llorona advanced toward the family, her eyes fixed on the children. Lucia and Javier screamed, clinging to their parents as the spirit reached out for them. The curandera quickly regained her composure, raising her hands in a defensive gesture as she resumed her chant. The spirit hissed, recoiling from the energy the curandera was directing at her, but she did not retreat. The battle continued for what felt like hours. The curandera and La Llorona locked in a struggle for control. The air crackled with energy, the candles flickering as the two forces clashed. Carlos and Maria could only watch in terror, unable to do anything to help. The children sobbed, their fear palpable, as the spirit's wails filled the room. Just when it seemed that the curandera was gaining the upper hand, La Llorona let out a final, deafening scream. The force of it knocked the curandera to the ground, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. The temperature plummeted even further, and the family felt a crushing pressure bearing down on them, as if the very air was being squeezed from their lungs. But the curandera was not defeated. With a strength born of desperation, she struggled to her feet and resumed her chant, her voice rising above the howling wind. The pressure began to lift, and the temperature slowly returned to normal. La Llorona's figure wavered, her form becoming less solid as the curandera's power pushed her back. Finally, with one last agonized wail, La Llorona vanished, dissipating into the night. The wind died down and the room grew still. The curandera collapsed, exhausted but victorious. The Ramirez family was shaken, but alive. The spirit had been driven away, but the scars of the encounter would remain with them forever. Part 7: The Aftermath. In the days that followed, the Ramirez family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the experience had left them deeply traumatized. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The sounds of the river that had once brought them peace now filled them with dread, a constant reminder of the horrors they had faced. Lucia and Javier were the most affected. The nightmares continued, though less frequently, and both children refused to go near the river. They were quiet, withdrawn, their once bright spirits dimmed by the terror they had endured. Carlos and Maria did their best to support them, but they too were struggling to cope. The image of La Llorona's ghostly figure haunted their thoughts, and they found themselves constantly on edge, as if expecting the spirit to return at any moment. The curandera visited them regularly, offering counsel and performing cleansing rituals to rid the house of any lingering negativity. She assured them that La Llorona was gone, that the spirit had been driven away and would not return. But the family remained unconvinced. The memory of that night was too fresh, too raw, and they could not shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows. Word of the Ramirez family's ordeal spread quickly through the town. Neighbors who had once been friendly now kept their distance, their expressions wary and fearful. The story of La Llorona was well known, but to hear that she had appeared so close to home was a chilling prospect. Some villagers offered their support, but others whispered that the Ramirez family must have done something to bring the curse upon themselves. Carlos, who had always prided himself on being a rational man, found himself questioning everything he had ever believed. The experience had shaken him to his core, leaving him unsure of what was real and what was not. He struggled to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was now, a man who had faced a ghost and survived, but at a cost. Part 8: A Glimmer of Hope. As the weeks turned into months, the Ramirez family slowly began to heal. The curandera's rituals seemed to have a positive effect, and the oppressive atmosphere in the house began to lift. The nightmares became less frequent, and the strange occurrences that had plagued them ceased. The children, though still haunted by their memories, started to show signs of recovery. They laughed more, played more, and gradually returned to their old selves. Maria, who had been the most affected by the haunting, also began to improve. She no longer heard La Llorona's voice calling her to the river, and the episodes of dissociation that had plagued her subsided. She took up gardening, finding solace in the simple act of tending to her plants. The garden, once overgrown and neglected, became a vibrant oasis, a place where the family could find peace and respite from their fears. Carlos threw himself into his work, determined to provide for his family and put the past behind him. He knew that they could never forget what had happened, but he was resolved to move forward, to rebuild their lives one step at a time. The experience had changed him, but it had also made him stronger, more resilient. He had faced the unthinkable and come out the other side, and he was determined to ensure that his family would do the same. The curandera continued to visit them, offering her wisdom and guidance. She spoke of the importance of maintaining balance and harmony in their lives, of respecting the spirits and the natural world around them. She reminded them that while they had been through a great ordeal, they had also been given a second chance, a chance to live their lives free from fear, if they chose to take it. Part 9: The Final Confrontation. Just as the Ramirez family began to feel a sense of normalcy returning to their lives, something happened that would change everything. It was a quiet evening, and the family was gathered in the living room, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in months, they felt a sense of safety. But as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, a coldness that seeped into their bones. The children looked at their parents with wide, frightened eyes, and Carlos felt a familiar sense of dread creeping over him. The silence was broken by a faint sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. La Llorona. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had called to her from the river, the voice that had nearly driven her to madness. Carlos sprang to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was happening, and he knew they had little time to act. Without hesitation, Carlos grabbed the children and pulled them close. He instructed Maria to gather the candles and the other items the curandera had left them for protection. But as they hurried to prepare, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Carlos lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. He held the children close, trying to calm their trembling forms. Maria began to recite the prayer the curandera had taught her, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more frantic, until they were nearly deafening. And then she appeared. Llorona materialized in the center of the room, her form more terrifying than ever. Her once white dress was now stained with blood, her hair matted and tangled. Her face, twisted in agony, was a mask of sorrow and rage. She floated above the ground, her empty eyes fixed on the children, and let out a wail so piercing that it felt like the very air was being ripped apart. Carlos and Maria screamed in unison, but their voices were drowned out by La Llorona's cry. The spirit lunged toward the children, her hands outstretched, and for a moment it seemed as if all hope was lost. But just as La Llorona was about to reach them, a bright light filled the room, blinding everyone. The curandera had arrived, her presence radiating with a power that pushed the spirit back. She began to chant, her voice firm and commanding, as she raised her hands to banish the spirit once and for all. Llorona shrieked in defiance, but the curandera's power was too strong. The spirit's form began to waver, her figure flickering like a candle flame in the wind. With one final, anguished scream, La Llorona was consumed by the light, and then she was gone. Part 10, moving on. The Ramirez family stood in stunned silence, the realization of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The curandera, exhausted but triumphant, approached them with a reassuring smile. "It's over," she said softly. Llorona is gone. Tears of relief filled Maria's eyes as she embraced her children, grateful beyond words that they had been spared. Carlos, still shaken but deeply relieved, thanked the curandera for saving their lives. The curandera nodded, but her expression was solemn. "You must be careful," she warned. "La Llorona's spirit may be gone, but the darkness she left behind can still linger. Stay vigilant and remember what you have learned." In the days that followed, the Ramirez family worked to rebuild their lives. They took the curandera's advice to heart, practicing the rituals she had taught them and remaining mindful of the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. The house, once filled with fear and sorrow, slowly regained its warmth and light. The nightmares stopped, and the oppressive presence that had haunted them was gone. The children began to smile and laugh again, their spirits slowly healing from the trauma they had endured. Carlos and Maria, though forever changed by the experience, found strength in each other and in their family. Though the memory of La Llorona would always be with them, the Ramirez family refused to let fear rule their lives. They had faced the darkness and survived, and they were determined to live each day with gratitude and hope. And so they moved on, leaving the horrors of the past behind. But the story of La Llorona, the weeping woman, would never be forgotten. It remained a chilling reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the terrible power of grief and sorrow. For those who dared to listen, the whispers of La Llorona could still be heard, carried on the wind as it swept across the river. A warning, perhaps, of the dangers that lay in the shadows, waiting for those who were unwary. But the Ramirez family had learned their lesson well. And though they would never forget the terror they had faced, they knew that they had been given a second chance. A chance to live, to love, and to find peace. And that, they vowed, was a gift they would never take for granted.